Hello there, I'm Dr. Jane Roskams, and I'm here at BrainMind with Dr. Helen Mayberg, who is widely recognized as one of the leading pioneers in the field of brain-computer interface and deep brain stimulation. So Helen, thank you for being at the meeting. Thank you for the provocative talk you just gave. I think it was a great contrast to some of the other speakers. And I'm going to fire off with something that I always felt with some of your work that made it different from many other people in the field. So go back to a time when you and Andres Lozano were busy wondering about deep brain stimulation. It's working for Parkinson's. That's an easy target. How important was really good brain imaging technology and understanding for you at the very beginning to begin to postulate and hypothesize how this could transfer across to something so much more widespread like depression?
I think at the end of the day, it would have been dangerous and reckless to even think about it, even if it occurred to me in those days without imaging. But on the other hand, for a neurologist to be studying depression, we have no business there in the absence of being able to map the brain. Mm-hmm. So it was really the 15 years of work before I met the surgeon, Andres Lozano,
right,
that really laid the foundation for saying there is a circuit, some regions are more important than others, and even that, what changes when you get well, because that becomes the target. Mm-hmm. So instead of trying to prevent depression, or instead of trying to say, let me make a guess, and as we would do now, equipotentiality, that anything could be right. Mm-hmm. I was much more linear in my thinking then, because the data could be modeled in a very linear and simple way.
Right.
So the fact that it was a guess doesn't really matter. It was an evidence-informed best estimate. Well, not a guess, an estimate with a clear, fast-to-fail approach. Because if the surgeon can put something in safely, and there's, except for the usual risk of surgery, there isn't a price you pay to try, where the ultimate is, if it doesn't work, you can just take it out.
Right.
And that's not a total null, but it's essentially a null because it's easy to take a device out. Mm-hmm. Then why would you not try it? Because you can test a hypothesis directly and see what happens. And then the hard part starts, because then you have to figure out what you did. But that's where the next generation or the third generation of devices or technologies ends up showing us good idea, approximate. Mm-hmm. And now how do you take the next generation of informations and get closer to what it really is?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that really struck me when I was listening this morning and looking at the sequence of talks in the next couple of days is the whole term BCI gets thrown out by all kinds of people who don't really understand a lot of the history of the field. Could you give us a couple of minutes on how much the technology has changed since you started to use it?
It's almost like you feel like a real dinosaur, that you're kind of you're still walking the earth, but like there's all this other stuff and I don't kind of really recognize it. Or, you try to keep up. And I'm being a little glib, but
right.
You got to stay in your lane and understand where your lane is, and then add technology. So what I kind of notice over time is what became the next transition for us that was huge. Mm-hmm. Because imaging, we refined a technique that was an approximation, not a guess, an approximation, and then reverse engineered. And we didn't do it with AI, but we kind of did it with a kind of imaging AI, right, a classifier type of approach, to then say, this part is solid. I don't know who the right patients are, but I know that if we use the usual rules and I go here, we'll be fine. So back to the BCI question. ... We're making really slow progress. And then Medtronic had a device that was a conventional DBS device that I knew how to use and all the tricks and all the limitations. And all it did was add on sensing. And when you suddenly had sensing, you had a new way other than intermittent imaging to kind of go, look, I'm not going to use it to figure out how I should do this differently. No, I'm going to model what we did. And if I know that 8, 9 out of every 10 will get better doing it the way we've done, put this new device in and just see what happens over 6 months. And then you have the situation that you could employ. You know, I have Chris Rizal, Shankar Alagappan at Georgia Tech, that we built a classifier. So we invoked the whole toolkit of signal processing, AI methods to, again, a relatively sparse data set, had people well, and said, how did they get there? And worked a year to figure out it wasn't linear. Every time we tried to model it linearly with a score, it didn't work until we used something we knew from 2000 in my original Prozac studies. I went through the same thing, I forgot till we saw the problem. Your brain on Prozac, a week on Prozac, you're not well, but your brain is different. And then at 6 weeks, you're either well or you're not well. What's happening to your brain at 1 week? What's happening at your brain at 6 weeks? And it turns out, when you go from 1 week to 6 weeks, different parts of the network switch the direction of what they're doing. It's like they adapt to the intervention. And if you don't switch, you don't get well. Applied that same logic actually to the DBS signal. It's the same. Different time scale, except we could look to where an individual switched, had this behavioral transition. And then when did that become stable in the brain? And now we can go back at the next layer of what is the behavior that goes with that? What is driving that? This one area of the brain is being forced into a new state, doesn't want to be there. And then it gets used to it, and then it evolves.
Got it.
So it's the technology from everyone else provides a way to test what we know, while simultaneously people are saying, well, you didn't get it totally right. No one gets 100% market share in a group of patients. You know, to dismiss that a company loses, you start from scratch, no other field does this except for psychiatry. And so once you have a toehold, then the question is, as new technology comes around, you use it. And then as you're making progress and you're in the language of another field, if there's dialogue, people are volunteering. So I had people see these pictures I would draw and they go, you know, you have an attractor state, don't you? You drew a bistable attractor. And then I had someone say, no, you built a linear attractor state, not a funnel attractor state. And suddenly I had people coming up to me, connected to the problem, usually personal, who saw it through this different data lens. And you suddenly have a bunch of new friends.
So you're talking about all these fine differences between how a brain that's impacted by deep brain stimulation could change over different periods of time, because everybody is individual. And one of the things we didn't stress at the beginning is we're not talking about all depression. We're talking about people who've been to the bottom of the pit and tried everything before they get to a surgery that will implant something that will change their brain in, you know, not irreversible ways, but in a lot more permanent ways than taking a pill every day. Now this has been in practice for a while, many years.
With a caveat.
Yeah, true. How close are we now to being able to, do we have the data to be able to more clearly stratify the responders versus not, the doses that will be needed, the frequencies? How close are we to being able to look at a patient before implant and say, okay, they fit this bin, which means they are 95% likely to have a life-changing experience after this?
So short answer is far, but let me tell you what we do know.
Great.
We know, again, parallel work in our lab has been for many years looking at less ill people to ask the question is, how do you pick the treatment that's best for someone
Right.
and avoid one you know won't work? Because it isn't just a zero if it doesn't work. It's time, it's toxicity, it is going what may be down the wrong road for you. So failing one drug doesn't mean you actually need a drug. What we've learned is same circuit can be in two states. One state really requires therapy, and drug will not work if your brain is in that state. Whereas that network in the opposite state responds to drug and therapy won't work. And we've published this, and it has a 90% accuracy to stratify the treatment. The attitude is, well, it's not like we're going to do a scan, decide how to treat people. So now we run into the stigma of mental illness, okay? You give people what they want, you say, no, I need to build it another way, okay? Number two, we've learned that the brain changes in those patients, but this biomarker doesn't change. It's kind of your brain type, and you add other problems. So the brain moves into another state, holding on to this biomarker when you recover. And then we've learned that, because we follow people over time that we've scanned, that we now have a signal of what predicts that you will relapse, despite that you're in remission. And that it's another thing. So it's like whack-a-mole. You change the state, and then the brain adapts around the state. So the non-linearity, the brain is not a move this and then it stays. The brain is always adapting, always changing. Every region, all those billions of neurons are in a dynamical relationship with each other. There are some backbone pieces. That's what I think we've fallen into by going to these very extreme patients, that the limbic system, which everyone hates that word, but Broca described the great limbic lobe, the cingulate. The cingulate and the hippocampus are the core of your brain.
Of our being. Right?
And if you break the cingulate, information processing isn't totally gone, but is going to be very disrupted. If you have a stroke and you damage the cingulate, you're an akinetic mute with no emotional tone. So that's the ultimate of stroking that area of the brain. We don't have a stroke. We have, in some ways, as stress demyelinates brain areas, this region becomes unstable, desynchronized, inefficient. And the phenomena is you can't kind of quite read your own emotion, you can't move away from it, because these regions meet in this area. It's a hub, it's a rich club hub. So I think that this idea of what we're watching, and again, how do you put the language of the patient, the language of psychiatry, into a model that engineers can hear and not see as, I don't hear the signal in that noise, so I will need to build a different model. And I think this one let me break, because I want to make a point that I think is in this. I think once you train or repair something that's broken, in every other treatment for depression, patients waiting for the relapse. And you reach a point with recurrent disease where it's happening. The question is how long? And will you have access? Ketamine, it's repeated treatment. TMS, turning out to be a retreated treatment. An implant means if you build a tracker signal, our signal actually can give us an alarm. I don't need a moment-to-moment mood tracker. I need to know when you have a big transition, and that we have a clue on. But then, once you're stable, there's the hand you're dealt, there's life stressors, and patients need to learn what is distress and what is depressed.
Right, versus a shift in state. Right?
Exactly.
Right.
And so you have to model the brain, the experience, take these tools and figure out ways to track over time, have patients learn that the tools themselves aren't just doing things to them, provide tools. People look at their own steps, people measure their own glucose, they alter their behavior based on information they can get from a device.
But we don't have the fine measures a lot of the time for those things that are leading us to that precipice. I want to finish up with something that I think you have been an eloquent leader in, and that many people might not be aware of, who jumped into, knowing that Neuralinks is happening and all these various different multi-electrode stimulation devices could get put in your brain. I remember being really impressed the first time I heard you present on looking into patients that had been different responders and realizing that it wasn't the device that was put in, but how the device was put in and implanted, and what the circuits of passage were that were touched by that device as the surgeon was putting it in. That made the difference. It was this moment for me in looking at somebody who was being truly responsible at getting to the bottom of things and looking at infusing ethical practice and best practices into the team that has to be involved in something like deep brain stimulation. You have been involved more than many on the whole neuroethics side of things, where does the responsibility lie in the treatment cycle once you've put something inside somebody's brain? I'm sure you have probably many opinions on this. Now there are so many people in the field, but for an audience that is more general, what are the things that we need to be aware of and look out for when we're having so much of this hype thrown in our faces about brain stimulation paradigms?
I think that, one has to filter hype by remembering that we start with people, they're not vulnerable, and the vulnerable, they can't make decisions. They have an illness, and they want to be well. And that one has to temper that when you're ill and suffering, you're willing to do things. And just because there might be things to try, one has to be responsible to kind of go, it's not that trying is the problem. I'm all for that. If we don't take chances. People thought I was reckless or lucky or whatever people thought about Arthur. I was not reckless at all.
Right.
I knew exactly, yes or no, this place. And I trusted a surgeon to say, can you do this? I had the back of an experience of DBS for Parkinson's. And I trusted a surgeon to say, I can do this safely. I think as we look at this, the brain will continue to evolve, will change as we put things into it. This is three-dimensional chess.
Right.
That it's not
It's a great visual.
one and done. That as you go to plan a move, you not only need to look a few steps ahead on the plane you're on, you also have to be looking above, below, at the other dimensions. And if you have the hubris to think that you have the answer, I used to think, in the late 80s when I started doing imaging as a neurologist in depression, I said, we've got this. This is a neurological problem. Well, it's partly a neurological problem. And then there's how do you train the brain? Because our brain is a learning machine, and it needs all the parts to be well-oiled, well-connected, so that you can train it and optimize it. I think that we're going to watch in this field is everybody will go through this, it's the hype scale. It really is. Everybody, no matter who it is, no matter how smart, no matter how much money, will go through the Gartner hype scale.
Yeah.
You'll maximize the technology, you'll get a good signal. Part of it's right, part of it's not right.
Right.
It'll go bad. We need to really temper that when we're annoyed with the cultural bit, we have a mission. Expect you're gonna go 3 steps forward, hopefully only 1 step back. And you stay on mission and you figure out where the pushback was, and you iterate.
Yeah.
This is an iterative process, and as we move forward, you don't know where we're going to be until we get there, which means you've got to have contingencies, other scenarios for what we'll do in each situation, and always have a backup plan.
Got it. So we're here at BrainMind, which is one of the very few meetings that tries to bring together the people at the forefront of, big questions like, treatment-resistant depression and other disorders that could be treated by DBS, engineering, tech, AI. What do you think this community could do to get more involved in your kind of work? And this is the last question. What would you like to see us do to be able to, augment this field and not feed into the hype?
So I think you made a really important point, because I think everyone wants to see the future. Everyone hopes that something new will be the next big thing. I think that what I would love to see this community do is to have the diversification of the portfolio. There's the investing in the things we can't even imagine it could be there. Do that. NIH is doing that. BC is doing that. Then there are the things that are kind of in position. Look, industry is going to do our trial again. It's upcoming, but they don't have a tracker signal. They don't have that technology. Fingers crossed. It'll go well with really, really careful, don't try to do too much, try to do what we're really certain of. But I think this community, as we learn, maybe you don't need a tracker signal in the brain. Maybe you can do it with a wearable. AI, language, I kind of tried to touch on it a little bit. We're trying to model our brain signal with something that isn't invasive, to take the high tech and get more low tech, because that is the world also.
Right, and that's where scalability and accessibility will come.
Everything has to be about not the next paper, not the best. Well, again, I come of two minds. I am the biggest cheerleader of these innovations. I cherry pick out of the innovations what are things I can learn that might explain, 100 levels of resolution lower. Where can I see those connections? And to take advantage of, if not the method, which is rare, but the thinking behind the method. And how can those tools, and AI is actually setting us free. And I really hope that, because if everything is about my idea and testing my idea, we lose. Too slow. Whereas if we can say we're in the right state space, what are tools that can come to bear to help us see things that are not present? That's the whole purpose of deep learning. And I think we're starting to see with a lot of the models that we can merge what is likely a keeper and the technology, and it will meet in the middle.
That's the
and
dream.
That'll really have the most bearing on the world.
Well, thank you very much for being here at BrainMind, and I hope that we will see you back here again.
Well, it's a pleasure, and thank you for including me.